Biker's prank turns into a nightmare when Jason Statham finds out. Scene 1. The calm before the storm. The sun hung lazily over the small town, casting a golden glow across the quiet streets. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the hum of daily life was soft and unhurried, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, children chasing each other with laughter, trailing behind them like ribbons in the wind. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery down the road, and the earthy scent of spring grass. It was a town that cradled its peace like a fragile treasure, a sanctuary for those who sought simplicity over chaos. And then came the roar. It started as a low rumble, a distant growl that crept closer, shaking the stillness like a predator stalking prey. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a ripple of unease passed through the townsfolk as the sound grew louder, more insistent. The motorcycles tore into view, their engines snarling, a pack of steel beasts cutting through the calm. At the head of the pack rode Rick "Crusher" Dalton, a man who seemed carved from the rough edges of the world. His leather jacket clung to his broad shoulders, weathered and scarred from years of riding hard and living harder. A thick beard framed his face, wild and untamed, and his eyes glinted with a restless hunger. But it was the smirk, that ever-present crooked twist of his lips, that told you everything you needed to know about him. It was a smirk that said he owned every room he walked into, every road he claimed, every moment he chose to disrupt. Behind him, his gang followed like shadows, their bikes gleaming under the sun, their faces a mix of admiration and fear. Rick was their king, their untouchable leader, the one who always had a wild challenge up his sleeve or a crude joke to keep them laughing. They looked to him for everything: courage, direction, a reason to feel invincible, and Rick thrived on it. He fed off their loyalty, their wide-eyed awe, the way they hung on his every word. To them, he was larger than life, a force of nature who bent the world to his will. That day, as they rolled into town, he felt it more than ever, the itch to stir things up, to leave his mark on this sleepy little place that seemed too soft, too fragile for men like him. The townsfolk watched from the edges of the street, their hands pausing mid-task, their breaths catching in their throats. An old man watering his flowers lowered his hose, water pooling forgotten at his feet. A young mother pulled her toddler closer, her eyes darting nervously between the bikers and the safety of her porch. At the outdoor tables of the cozy cafe ahead, people hunched over their coffee cups, hoping the storm would pass them by. They weren't used to this loud, brash intrusion that felt like a fist slamming through their quiet morning. But Rick didn't care about their unease. He reveled in it. The way their heads turned, the way their whispers faded into silence, it was power, pure and simple. He leaned back on his bike as they pulled up in front of the cafe, the engine's growl dying down to a low purr, and that smirk widened. This was his stage now, and he was ready to perform. He swung his leg off the bike, boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud, and stretched his arms wide as if claiming the whole damn town. His gang fanned out behind him, their laughter rough and jagged, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Rick tilted his head, scanning the street with a predator's eye, looking for something, anything, to spark his next move. The sun glinted off his jacket, catching the worn patches and the faint stains of a life lived on the edge. He was a man who didn't just walk through the world, he stomped through it, leaving cracks in his wake. And today, in this little town that smelled of bread and innocence, he was itching to break something. The cafe sat nestled at the corner, its wooden deck warm under the sunlight, its windows reflecting the peaceful hum of the day. 2 dogs rested near the entrance, a golden retriever with eyes like melted honey and a Doberman, sleek and vigilant, watching the world with quiet strength. They were beautiful, cared for, loved. But Rick didn't see that yet. All he saw was an audience waiting to be rattled, a chance to prove he was still the toughest man in the room or on the street. He nudged one of his boys, a wiry kid with a nervous grin, and chuckled low in his throat. "Time to have some fun," he said, his voice gravelly, thick with mischief. The kid laughed, too eager to please, and the others joined in, their voices rising like a chorus of wolves. The townsfolk held their breath, sensing the shift in the air. They didn't know what was coming, but they felt it, the way you feel a storm brewing before the first drop falls. Rick didn't notice their fear, or if he did, it only fueled him more. He was here to shake this place awake, to remind them that men like him didn't bow to quiet streets or gentle days. And as he stood there, smirking under the sun, he had no idea that someone else was watching, someone who wouldn't let his chaos go unanswered. Scene 2. The spark of cruelty. The small town had settled into a fragile stillness as Rick, Crusher, Dalton and his gang parked their roaring beasts in front of the cafe. The sun bathed the wooden deck in a soft, golden light, and the air carried the faint sweetness of blooming flowers from a nearby garden. It was a scene so gentle it almost ached, a place where the world felt kind, where people sipped their coffee and traded quiet smiles over the clink of porcelain cups. The motorcycle's engines sputtered to a halt, but their echo lingered, a jagged scar across the day's peace. Rick stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. His gang fanned out behind him, their laughter sharp and restless, like hyenas circling a meal. The townsfolk watched from the edges, their eyes wide, their hands clutching whatever they held. A broom, a child's tiny fingers, a half-eaten pastry, as if those small things could shield them from the storm that had just rolled in. Rick's gaze swept the street, hungry for something to claim. He thrived on this, the way people shrank under his shadow, the way their whispers died in their throats. It was power, raw and intoxicating, and he drank it in with every breath. His smirk widened as he spotted them, 2 dogs sitting near the cafe's entrance, their presence a quiet testament to care and love. The golden retriever's fur shimmered like spun gold, its eyes soft and trusting, the kind of eyes that could melt even the hardest heart. Beside it sat the Doberman, black and tan, its muscles taut beneath a glossy coat, its posture regal yet calm, a guardian carved from loyalty. They were beautiful, perfect in their stillness, watching the world pass by with an unspoken grace. To anyone else, they were a sight to admire, a reminder of the goodness that could thrive in a place like this. But to Rick, they were something else, a target, a chance to flex his dominance, to make his boys laugh and the town tremble. He nudged the wiry kid next to him, a twitchy young biker with a grin too big for his face. "Look at these fancy little pets," Rick said, his voice rough as gravel, dripping with mockery. "Living better than us, huh?" The gang chuckled, their laughter a jagged chorus that sliced through the air. Rick's eyes glinted with mischief, his mind already spinning a cruel little game. He didn't see the dogs for what they were, companions, protectors, souls with beating hearts. He saw props, a punchline to his endless need to prove he was untouchable. The idea hit him like a spark, and before he could think twice, before he could feel the weight of what he was about to do, he acted. With a slow, deliberate swagger, he stepped closer to the dogs. The golden retriever tilted its head, its gentle eyes meeting his, unafraid, trusting in a way that should have stopped him cold. But Rick didn't stop. He lifted his heavy boot, the leather scuffed and stained from years of stomping over anything in his path, and with a casual flick, he tapped the dog's side. It wasn't a brutal kick, not the kind that would break bones, but it was enough to startle, enough to hurt. The golden retriever let out a sharp, surprised yelp, a sound so raw and innocent it seemed to pierce the sky. Its paws scrambled as it stumbled back, confusion clouding those soft eyes, its tail tucking low. The Doberman sprang to its feet in an instant, ears pricked, body tense, a low growl rumbling in its chest. But it didn't lunge. It held its ground, trained too well to strike without command, though every line of its form screamed protection. The street froze, a gasp rippled through the cafe's outdoor tables, a collective breath stolen from lungs too shocked to breathe. A waitress, her arms full of a tray, faltered. Cups and saucers crashed to the ground, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. A little boy with an ice cream cone squeezed it so hard the scoop toppled to the pavement, melting into a sad puddle as his wide eyes locked on the scene. The townsfolk stared, their faces pale, their hearts sinking with a quiet, helpless ache for the dog that had done nothing to deserve this. Rick threw his head back and laughed, a deep, booming sound that rolled over the silence like thunder. "See that?" he crowed, turning to his gang. "Jumped like a scared little rabbit." His boys chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between their leader and the stunned crowd, unsure if they should join in or pull back. But Rick didn't care about their hesitation. He didn't see the fear in the golden retriever's eyes, the way its body shrank as it tried to understand why its world had tilted. He didn't feel the weight of the Doberman's gaze, steady and piercing, as if it were memorizing his face. He didn't hear the soft whimper that lingered in the air, a sound that wrapped around the hearts of everyone watching and squeezed tight. To him, it was just a joke, a fleeting thrill, a way to keep his crown. He stood there, chest puffed out, smirking under the sun, oblivious to the storm he'd just unleashed, oblivious to the man inside the cafe whose sharp eyes had seen it all, whose quiet strength was already stirring, ready to answer the cruelty with something Rick could never have imagined. Scene 3. The Watcher in the Shadows. Inside the cozy cafe, the world felt like a warm embrace. The wooden floors glowed under the soft spill of sunlight through the windows, and the air carried the gentle hum of conversation, the clink of teaspoons against porcelain, the faint aroma of brewed tea and fresh scones. It was a sanctuary, a bubble of calm where time slowed just enough for people to breathe, to savor the small joys of an ordinary day. At a table near the window, a man sat alone, his presence steady and unassuming. His hands cradled a simple cup of tea, steam curling upward in delicate wisps, and his sharp, weathered face was softened by the light. He was broad-shouldered, his frame hinting at strength earned through years of discipline, but there was no arrogance in him, just a quiet stillness that seemed to anchor the room. His dogs, his loyal companions, waited outside, and every so often his eyes flicked toward them, a flicker of warmth passing through his gaze. This was Jason Statham, though no one in the cafe dared disturb him with that name. To them, he was just a man enjoying a moment of peace, a stranger who carried an air of something deeper, something unspoken. Outside, the street had erupted into chaos. Rick Crusher Dalton's cruel laughter still hung in the air, thick and heavy, a sound that grated against the town's fragile serenity. The golden retriever's yelp, a sharp, piercing cry of confusion, had sliced through the morning like a knife, and now the dog cowered, its soft eyes darting, its body trembling as it tried to make sense of the hurt. The Doberman stood tall beside it, a sentinel of muscle and loyalty, its ears twitching, its dark gaze locked on the biker who'd dared to strike. The townsfolk stood frozen, their hearts sinking into a shared ache, their breaths held as if the world might shatter if they let them go. A waitress clutched her apron, her knuckles white, tears brimming in her eyes for the innocent creature she'd watched grow up at the cafe's doorstep. A little boy, his ice cream forgotten on the ground, clung to his mother's skirt, whispering, Why'd he do that, Mama? The question hung unanswered, heavy with the weight of a child's confusion. Jason's hand froze mid-air, the teacup hovering just above the saucer. That yelp, it wasn't just a sound, it was a call, a plea, a thread that tugged at something deep inside him, something fierce and protective. His dogs weren't just pets, they were family, pieces of his soul that he'd vowed to shield from the world's ugliness. He'd heard every note of that cry, the surprise, the fear, the betrayal, and it pierced him like a shard of glass. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the cup, the soft clink of ceramic against ceramic, cutting through the cafe's hush. His sharp eyes lifted from the table, narrowing as they found the scene beyond the glass. There was Rick, standing tall in his leather jacket, his beard bristling, his smirk wide and careless as he laughed with his gang. The golden retriever stepped back, its tail low, its trust shaken. The Doberman's stance tightened, a coiled spring of restraint, waiting for a command that hadn't come, and Jason saw it all, the cruelty, the arrogance, the way Rick reveled in the chaos he'd sown. His jaw tightened, a subtle shift that spoke volumes to anyone watching. The cafe owner, an older man with kind eyes and a weathered smile, had been wiping down the counter when the yelp rang out. He froze, his rag dangling in his hand, and his gaze darted to Jason. He knew those dogs, knew the man who cared for them, and in that moment, he understood what was brewing. His face paled, a flicker of dread passing through him as he stepped closer to Jason's table. "Sir," he whispered, his voice trembling just enough to betray his fear, "I think that biker just made a huge mistake." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than words, a storm gathering behind those steady, unblinking eyes. He pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood against the floor a quiet thunder in the stillness, and stood. His movements were slow, controlled, every inch of him radiating a strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. The people in the cafe exchanged glances, their breaths catching as they watched him. They knew who he was, not just the man from the movies, but the one who'd walked into their town with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. They'd heard the stories, seen the way he moved with purpose, the way his hands spoke of fights won and lessons learned. And now, as he turned toward the door, they felt it, the shift in the air, the promise of something inevitable. Outside, Rick laughed again, oblivious, his gang chuckling nervously at his side. But inside, Jason's heart beat steady and strong, a drum roll for the justice he was about to deliver. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was loud, reckless. What burned in him was colder, sharper, a resolve forged from love for the dogs who trusted him with their lives. As his hand touched the door, the townsfolk held their breath, and the world seemed to pause, waiting for the man who would rewrite the story Rick had begun. Scene 4. The reckoning begins. The air outside the cafe thickened with a silence that pressed against the chest, heavy and expectant, as if the town itself held its breath. The golden retriever's soft whimper still lingered, a fragile echo that wrapped around the hearts of the onlookers, tugging at their edges until they frayed. The dog stood close to the Doberman now, its golden fur trembling slightly, its eyes wide with a confusion that cut deeper than any wound. The Doberman remained a statue of vigilance, its sleek form taut, its dark gaze fixed on Rick Crusher Dalton, who stood oblivious in the center of his chaos. Rick's laughter rolled out again, rough and jagged, a sound that scraped against the stillness like a blade on stone. His gang hovered behind him, their chuckles faltering, their eyes darting nervously as the townsfolk's stunned faces reflected something they couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also a quiet, growing anticipation. The cafe door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, and Jason Statham stepped out onto the wooden deck. His boots hit the planks with a steady thud, each step a heartbeat in the silence, each movement laced with a calm that felt more dangerous than any shout. The sunlight caught the hard lines of his face, sharp jaw, weathered skin, eyes like steel, and cast a shadow that stretched long and dark across the pavement. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a force, a tide shifting the air, pulling every gaze toward him. The townsfolk watched, their hands tightening around coffee cups and aprons, their pulses quickening with a mix of awe and dread. They knew this man, not just from the screen, but from the way he carried himself, the way he'd sat quietly among them, a stranger who'd brought his dogs and his peace into their world. Now, that peace was gone, replaced by something fiercer, something unyielding. Rick turned, his smirk still plastered across his face, though it twitched at the edges as he caught sight of Jason. "What's this?" he said, his voice loud, brash, a challenge thrown into the wind. He crossed his arms, his leather jacket creaking, his beard bristling as he sized up the man walking toward him. "You got a problem, mate?" His gang snickered, but it was a hollow sound, thin and uncertain, as if they sensed the ground shifting beneath them. Jason didn't answer, not yet. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto Rick's with a focus that pierced through the biker's bravado. Those eyes weren't angry, not in the way Rick expected. They were calm, cold, a storm held back by a thread of control, and that stillness unnerved Rick more than any fist ever could. "You kicked my dog," Jason said at last, his voice low and steady, each word a stone dropped into deep water. It wasn't a question, it was a fact, heavy with the weight of what it meant to him. The golden retriever shifted closer to his side, its tail brushing the ground, its soft eyes lifting to Jason as if seeking reassurance. The Doberman didn't move, but its ears flicked, its loyalty a silent promise. Rick scoffed, rolling his eyes, his smirk twisting into something defensive. "It was just a little tap, mate. Relax," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite land. His gang laughed too, softer now, their confidence fraying as they glanced between their leader and the man who stood like a wall before him. Jason tilted his head just slightly, his gaze never wavering. "You think it's funny?" he asked, his tone so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made Rick's stomach tighten. The biker shrugged, shifting his weight, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. The townsfolk, his gang, the dogs. "Didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered, his voice losing its edge. "Just having a bit of fun." But the words felt hollow even to him as Jason took one step closer. The space between them shrank, and with it, Rick's bravado began to crack. He swallowed hard, his hands flexing at his sides, his smirk fading into something unsteady. Then, in a blur too fast to track, Jason moved. It wasn't a punch, not a wild swing, just a precise, fluid motion. His foot tapped Rick's in just the right spot, a subtle twist, and before the biker could blink, his legs buckled. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, and hit the ground with a loud thud, dust kicking up around him. The gang gasped, their laughter dying in their throats. The townsfolk flinched, a collective intake of breath rippling through them. Rick blinked up from the dirt, his face red with shock, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Jason stood over him, unchanged, calm, controlled, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Not so funny now, is it?" he said quietly, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. The golden retriever let out a small, tentative bark, as if testing the air, and the sound broke the spell. The townsfolk exhaled, their eyes wide with something between relief and wonder. Rick scrambled to his knees, his pride bruised more than his body, and for the first time that day, he felt small. Jason didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stood there, a quiet guardian, his dogs at his side. And the town knew this was only the beginning. Scene 5, the fall of pride. The dust still hung in the air, a faint haze swirling around Rick Crusher Dalton as he knelt on the pavement, his breath ragged, his hands gripping the ground. The thud of his fall echoed in the silence, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the small town, shaking loose the last threads of the morning's peace. His leather jacket was streaked with dirt, his beard tangled, and his smirk, once a banner of his untouchable confidence, had vanished, replaced by a flush of red that crept up his neck. Above him, Jason Statham stood like a pillar, his boots planted firm, his sharp eyes steady and unyielding. The golden retriever pressed closer to Jason's leg, its soft fur brushing against him, its trembling eased by the quiet strength of the man who'd answered its cry. The Doberman remained a shadow of vigilance, its sleek form a silent promise of protection, its gaze locked on Rick with an intensity that felt almost human. The townsfolk watched, their hearts pounding in their chests, a mix of awe and relief washing over them like a tide. The waitress, her tray long forgotten, clutched her hands to her chest, her eyes glistening with unshed tears for the dog she'd watched suffer. The little boy, still clinging to his mother, peeked out from behind her skirt, his small face alight with wonder at the man who'd turned the chaos upside down. Rick's gang stood frozen, their laughter choked off, their wide eyes darting between their leader and the stranger who'd felled him without breaking a sweat. The air crackled with tension, thick and heavy, as if the world teetered on the edge of something bigger, something irreversible. Rick's chest heaved as he pushed himself to his feet, his pride a jagged wound that bled through every move. He couldn't stay down. Not here, not now, not in front of his boys. They'd followed him through fights and storms, cheered his every reckless stunt, and now they stared, waiting for him to reclaim the throne he'd built from bravado and steel. He straightened his jacket, the leather creaking under his trembling hands, and glared at Jason, his breath hot and uneven. "All right, tough guy," he growled, his voice rough with shame and fury. "You think you can embarrass me like that and walk away?" The words were a challenge, a desperate grasp at the power slipping through his fingers. His gang shifted, their loyalty wavering, but they nodded, urging him on with half-hearted grunts. Jason didn't move. His hands rested loose at his sides, his face a mask of calm that cut deeper than any taunt. "You want to try again?" he asked, his voice low, almost bored, as if Rick's rage were a child's tantrum he'd seen 100 times before. The question hung there, a dare wrapped in quiet certainty, and it lit a fire in Rick's gut. He couldn't back down, not with every eye in the town on him, not with his gang watching, not with the sting of that fall burning in his bones. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening, and lunged forward, swinging a wild punch aimed straight for Jason's jaw. The motion was fueled by desperation, a roar of defiance against the humiliation that clawed at him. But Jason was faster, too fast. He sidestepped with a grace that belied his size, his body flowing like water around Rick's fist. In one smooth motion, he caught Rick's wrist, twisted it just enough to throw him off balance, and turned the biker's own momentum against him. Rick stumbled forward, his boots scraping the pavement, and crashed into a wooden table nearby. The table splintered under his weight, plates and cups shattering in a cacophony of porcelain and clatter, scattering across the ground like broken pieces of his pride. He groaned, sprawled amid the wreckage, his breath hitching as pain flared through his ribs. The gang stared, their mouths agape, their fearless leader reduced to a heap of leather and dust. The townsfolk gasped, a collective sound that rippled through the crowd, their hands flying to their mouths. The cafe owner winced, his kind eyes flickering with pity, not for Rick, but for the mess he'd made of himself. Rick struggled to his knees, his face twisted with rage and shame, his hands clawing at the debris. He couldn't stop, not yet. His pride wouldn't let him. He charged again, a bull blinded by fury, hoping to catch Jason off guard, but Jason didn't flinch. With a single, controlled strike to Rick's chest, not hard enough to break, but sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs, Jason sent him reeling back. Rick stumbled, gasping, his hands clutching his chest as his legs buckled beneath him. He sank to the ground once more, his breath a ragged wheeze, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that he was outmatched. Jason stepped closer, his shadow falling over Rick like a verdict. "You kicked my dog," he said, his voice steady, each word a weight that pressed Rick deeper into the dirt. "Now you know how it feels." The golden retriever let out a soft whine, its head nudging Jason's hand, and the sound pierced the silence, a reminder of why this had begun. Rick's gang took a step back, their faces pale, their bravado crumbling. The townsfolk watched, their smiles breaking through the tension, a quiet triumph blooming in their chests. Rick lay there, breathless, broken, and for the first time he felt the weight of his own cruelty staring back at him. Scene 6. The depths of defeat. The street lay silent, a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of Rick Crusher Dalton's pride. Shards of broken plates glinted in the sunlight, scattered like the fragments of a life he'd thought unbreakable. His chest ached, a dull throb where Jason Statham's precise strike had stolen his breath, and his hands trembled as they pressed against the pavement, clawing for something, anything, to hold on to. The dust settled around him, a gritty veil that stung his eyes and coated his throat, but it was nothing compared to the weight crushing his soul. He'd fallen again, harder this time, and the town watched with bated breath, their eyes wide with a mix of pity and quiet triumph. The golden retriever stood at Jason's side, its soft fur brushing his leg, its gentle eyes flickering between its protector and the man who'd hurt it. The Doberman loomed beside them, a shadow of strength, its gaze piercing Rick with a judgment that felt almost alive. Rick's gang stood at the edges, their boots scuffing the ground, their faces pale and uncertain. The men who'd once roared with him, who'd laughed at his every cruel jest, now looked away, their loyalty unraveling like thread pulled too tight. The wiry kid who'd grinned at Rick's taunts stared at his leader's crumpled form, his mouth slack, his hands twitching as if he didn't know where to put them. The townsfolk, too, felt the shift. The waitress wiped her eyes with her apron, her lips trembling with relief. The little boy clutched his mother's hand, his small voice whispering, "He's not so tough now, is he?" The air was thick with the aftermath, a stillness that pressed down on Rick until he could barely breathe, until the weight of his own actions bore down like a storm he couldn't outrun. He pushed himself up, his arms shaking, his pride a jagged shard lodged in his chest. He couldn't stay down, not again, not like this. He'd built his name on being untouchable, on stomping through life with a smirk and a swagger, and now it was slipping away, bleeding out in front of everyone he'd meant to impress. His eyes locked on Jason, who stood calm and unshaken, his hands loose at his sides, his sharp gaze steady as stone. Rick's breath hitched, his mind racing for a way out, a way to claw back the power he'd lost. His hand fumbled to his pocket, fingers closing around the cold metal of a small pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was something, a last, desperate bid to turn the tide. With a flick, he snapped it open, the blade catching the light, and held it out, his grip tight, his chest heaving. "You think you've won?" he rasped, his voice raw with defiance and fear. The town gasped, a collective sound that rippled through the crowd like a wave. The cafe owner stepped back, his kind eyes widening with dread, and the little boy buried his face in his mother's skirt, a whimper escaping him. Rick's gang froze, their breaths catching, unsure if they should cheer or flee. But Jason didn't flinch. He sighed, a soft, almost weary sound, and shook his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his voice steady, a quiet thunder that rolled over Rick's trembling frame. The biker lunged, the knife slashing toward Jason's side, a wild, reckless move born of desperation. But Jason was faster, always faster. His hand shot forward, closing around Rick's wrist in a grip like iron, and with a single fluid twist, he forced the blade from Rick's fingers. It clattered to the ground, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed in the silence, and Rick gasped, his knees buckling as pain flared through his arm. Jason tightened his hold, just enough to make Rick feel it. Feel the helplessness, the powerlessness he'd inflicted on the golden retriever with that careless kick. The biker's face twisted, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts, his eyes darting to the knife he couldn't reach. Jason leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, piercing whisper. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said, each word a weight that sank into Rick's bones. "Now imagine how my dog felt." The golden retriever let out a soft whine, its head tilting as if it understood, and the sound cut through Rick like a blade. He didn't speak, couldn't. His wrist burned, his pride shattered, and for the first time he felt small, exposed, stripped bare under the eyes of the town and the man who'd undone him. Jason held his gaze a moment longer, then released him, stepping back with the same calm he'd carried from the start. Rick crumpled, his hands shaking, his breath a broken sob he tried to swallow. The knife lay between them, glinting in the dust, but he didn't dare reach for it. His gang watched, silent, their fearless leader reduced to a shadow of himself. The townsfolk stared, some with wide eyes, others with small, knowing smiles, their hearts swelling with a quiet justice. Rick's world had crumbled, and in that moment he knew he'd pushed too far, and the cost was more than he could bear. Scene 7, the final stand. The small town stood still, its heartbeat suspended in the dust-choked air. Rick, Crusher, Dalton knelt on the pavement, his wrist throbbing where Jason Statham's grip had released him, his chest heaving with shallow, broken breaths. The pocket knife lay abandoned between them, its blade glinting dully in the sunlight, a fallen relic of his last, desperate stand. His leather jacket hung heavy on his shoulders, streaked with dirt and defeat, and his beard framed a face flushed with shame, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. The golden retriever sat quietly at Jason's side, its soft fur catching the light, its gentle eyes watching Rick with a calm that felt like forgiveness he didn't deserve. The Doberman stood tall beside it, a sentinel of strength, its gaze unwavering as if it could see straight through the biker's crumbling facade. The silence was deafening, a weight that pressed down on Rick until his bones ached with it, until the world he'd built from bravado and noise collapsed around him. His gang lingered at the edges, their boots scuffing the ground, their faces pale and hollow. The men who'd once roared with him, who'd followed him into every reckless storm, now stood like ghosts, their loyalty shattered by the sight of their leader undone. The wiry kid who'd laughed at Rick's cruel jests stared at the pavement, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his bravado snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The townsfolk watched, their breaths held, their hearts swelling with a quiet, trembling hope. The waitress clutched her apron, her eyes shining with tears she no longer tried to hide. The little boy peeked from behind his mother, his small hand tightening around hers as he whispered, "He's not going to fight anymore, is he?" The question hung there, fragile and true, a child's voice cutting through the tension like a bell. Rick's hands shook as he pushed himself to his feet, his pride a raw, bleeding wound he couldn't staunch. He'd lost in front of his gang, lost in front of this town, lost in front of the man who stood before him like a wall he couldn't break. His chest burned with the memory of Jason's strike, his wrist ached with the echo of that iron grip, and his mind reeled with the words that had pierced him deeper than any blade. That's how it feels to be helpless. Now imagine how my dog felt. The golden retriever's soft whine replayed in his ears, a sound that clawed at him now, stripping away the armor he'd worn so long. He wanted to fight, to scream, to claw back the power he'd wielded like a crown, but his body wouldn't move, his voice wouldn't come. He was empty, hollowed out by the weight of his own cruelty staring back at him. Jason stood there, his boots planted firm, his sharp eyes locked on Rick with a calm that felt like judgment. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His presence was enough, a quiet strength that filled the space, a promise kept to the dogs who trusted him with their lives. "Let's go," Rick muttered, his voice barely a rasp, his gaze dropping to the ground. He couldn't look at Jason, couldn't face the gang he'd led, couldn't bear the eyes of the town that had seen him fall. He turned, his steps unsteady, and stumbled toward his bike, his hands fumbling with the handlebars as if they belonged to someone else. His gang hesitated, their breaths catching, then one by one they followed, their heads low, their shadows trailing behind them like a funeral march. The roar of the engines sputtered to life, a sound that had once thundered with confidence but now whimpered with defeat. The bikes rolled away, their noise fading into the distance, leaving the town in a hush that felt like healing. Jason watched them go, his hands resting loose at his sides, his face unchanged. Then he spoke, his voice firm but calm, cutting through the silence like a final note. "Next time," he said, "think before you try to prove how tough you are." The words landed on Rick's retreating back, a lesson carved into the air, a warning he'd carry long after the bruises faded. The townsfolk exhaled, their shoulders easing, their smiles breaking through like sunlight after a storm. The waitress let out a shaky laugh, wiping her eyes, and the little boy tugged at his mother's hand, grinning up at Jason with wide, shining eyes. The golden retriever wagged its tail, a slow, tentative sweep, and nudged Jason's hand, its trust restored. The Doberman relaxed, its ears softening, its duty done. Rick was gone, his gang with him, and the town stood taller, its peace reclaimed. Jason turned back toward the cafe, his dogs at his heels, and the crowd parted for him, their whispers soft with awe. In that moment, they knew they'd witnessed something more than a fight. They'd seen justice, quiet and sure, and it lingered in their hearts like a promise. Scene 8. The quiet. After the storm, the roar of the motorcycles faded into a distant hum, swallowed by the horizon, leaving the small town wrapped in a hush that felt like a sigh of relief. The dust settled gently on the pavement, softening the scars of the day, the splintered table, the scattered shards of porcelain, the glint of Rick Crusher Dalton's abandoned knife. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, casting a warm glow over the cafe's wooden deck where Jason Statham stood, his shadow long and steady. The golden retriever pressed against his leg, its golden fur catching the light, its tail sweeping the ground in slow, happy arcs. The Doberman sat beside him, its sleek form relaxed at last, its dark eyes scanning the street as if to ensure the trouble had truly gone. The air smelled of earth and spring again, the faint sweetness of flowers creeping back as if the town itself were exhaling, reclaiming its peace. The townsfolk lingered, their faces soft with wonder, their hands loosening from the grips they'd held so tight. The waitress stepped forward, her apron twisted in her fingers, her eyes still shimmering with the tears she'd shed for the dog she loved like her own. She smiled, a small, trembling thing, and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice barely audible, but thick with gratitude. The little boy broke free from his mother's grasp, his sneakers pattering against the pavement as he ran to the golden retriever. He crouched down, his small hand reaching out to stroke its fur, and looked up at Jason with eyes wide and bright. "Is your dog okay?" he asked, his voice soft, laced with a child's earnest care. Jason knelt beside him, his rough hand brushing the dog's ears, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, his tone gentle, a rare warmth breaking through his steady calm. "He's okay now." The boy grinned, his fingers lingering in the soft fur, and the dog let out a happy bark, its joy a balm that spread through the crowd. The cafe owner emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron, a chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "that was quite a show." His kind eyes crinkled as he looked at Jason, then at the mess Rick had left behind. "After what you just did, the next cup of tea's on the house." Jason gave a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips, and turned back toward the cafe, his dogs following close. The townsfolk parted for him, their whispers soft and reverent, their gazes following the man who'd walked into their lives like a passing storm, fierce, fleeting, but unforgettable. An elderly woman with a cane hobbled forward, her smile wide and knowing. "That was amazing," she said, her voice trembling with age and admiration. "You didn't even have to do much, and you still taught that man a lesson he won't forget." Jason paused, his hand resting on the golden retriever's head, and looked at her. "Some people think strength is about showing off," he said simply, his voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of a life lived with purpose. "But real strength is knowing when to use it and when not to." The words settled over the crowd like a quiet truth, sinking into their hearts, stirring a warmth that felt like pride. The cafe owner laughed again, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't think they'll be back any time soon," he said, glancing down the empty road. "And if they do, they'll think twice before causing trouble." Jason didn't reply, but that faint smile lingered, a silent agreement as he stepped inside, the dogs at his heels, the door swinging shut behind them. The town breathed again, its rhythm returning. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, children chased each other once more, their laughter ringing like bells. The cafe bustled with life, the clink of cups and the hum of voices weaving a tapestry of normalcy. Yet the story lingered, a thread stitched into the fabric of the place. Days passed, and the townsfolk still spoke of it, how Jason had come and gone, how he'd faced down Rick with nothing but calm and courage, how he'd stood for the dogs who couldn't stand for themselves. The cafe owner grinned every time someone brought it up, leaning on the counter as he said, "I've seen plenty of tough guys come through here, but I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that, didn't even break a sweat." The little boy reenacted it for his friends, his arms flailing as he shouted, "And then, bam! He just moved so fast the biker didn't know what hit him." Rick and his gang never returned, their absence a quiet victory that settled over the town like a blanket. The road stretched on, welcoming travelers who passed through with a nod and a wave, and the cafe remained a beacon of warmth. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, casting long shadows across the peaceful streets, the townsfolk carried on, their lives safe once more. Somewhere out there, Jason Statham and his loyal dogs continued their journey, leaving behind a story that would be told and retold, a tale of strength, of kindness, of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. And in that small town, they knew they'd never forget the day justice walked in on quiet boots and left with a wag of a tail.